Now we're going to spend time focusing on the sound that makes up our bass line. And obviously this is very important, but don't overthink this. If the bass sound sounds good to you, then it is good. And we want to keep the big picture in mind and stay creative. But we're going to talk about 4 categories of bass sounds that you can use to create your bass lines. The first one is analog style synths. The second is digital style synths. The third is live bass. And the fourth is non-traditional bass sounds. And we can learn about these and have an idea and use those to create your bass lines. Without a doubt, one of the best ways for creating one-of-a-kind custom sounds is through the use of layering. Now, since we're talking about the bass line, we're going to go into the sounds that I use to create the layers for my bass line. And when I'm going to layer something, I always tend to break it up into different frequency ranges. So for a bass line, I'll think about the fundamentals, or kind of a low frequency range. I'll also have a high frequency range that I keep in mind, and then a sub frequency range. And when I'm layering things, I'll ultimately put different layers in different frequency ranges, and this does a couple things. First of all, it helps us achieve a really nice wide frequency spectrum, but then also it avoids what's called masking. And masking is when 2 sounds occupy the same frequency space. So in the case of a bass line, if I have 2 layers both playing a low frequency range, they might cover each other up. So if I have a low frequency on one synth patch, I might layer it with something else and have it slightly higher. And this avoids this and helps create an even more custom sound. Now, going in and altering a synth and tweaking the parameters is a great way for designing sounds. But by using layers, it's a fast and easy way to also achieve custom sounds, and it also allows you to go way beyond what any one particular synth is capable of. Okay, so I brought up 3 new instrument tracks, and I'm going to show you each layer that I used to create the bass sound. The first one is a channel strip setting in Synth Bass folder. It's called Analog Deep Bass. And a channel strip basically not only brings up an instrument, but also inserts that help shape the sound. So let's go ahead and listen to this first Analog Deep Bass. Alright. So the next layer, I've brought up an EVB3. And this is going to be kind of an organ, non-traditional type bass sound. And that's usually a really good layer in the high frequency ranges. The third layer, I've brought up a mono ES1 instrument, and I've set the patch to be the sub-bass patch, and that's going to give us some really great low end that's going to sound really good in the club. So we recorded our bass line earlier with kind of a standard bass sound, but if you're going to be using layers and you design the sound first and then worry about the pattern afterwards, what you can do is record enable all 3 of your layered sounds, and that's going to allow you to trigger them all at the same time. So that's all 3 of them at the same time, and that'll help you hear the sound and really shape it the way you want. Now also, since we're starting to get a little more tracks, you may be hearing some clipping or overloading. So you want to come into the mixer and always pay attention to output 1 and 2. And just make sure it's not overloading at all. Now we're going to go into great detail about the master bus. It's a very important topic, but right now we're just going to make sure it's not clipping. Okay, so since we have our bass region up here, the way we're going to do this is we're going to drag it down to this analog deep patch, which is our first layer in the bass line. And then to copy this over, I'm not simply going to option drag this down, because even though that copies it down, if I want to make changes to this MIDI region, I need to make sure that all of these layers are responding to the same thing. And the best way to do this is to select the MIDI region and hit Command R. That's going to bring up a repeat regions dialog. And you want to make sure you copy them as aliases or clones. So we're going to create 2 clones of this. And when we do that, it automatically copies 2 regions to the right of it. And you'll notice that they kind of have a little arrow dialog and then an italicized name to it. And that'll tell you that those are clones. And what this will do is this will allow you to come into the MIDI region, make any edits that you want, and all 3 layers will all stay the same. So let's solo each one of these layers. There's that analog deep bass patch. I'm going to bring in the organ, and I'm going to select the organ track. And If we come up to the top, there's this transposition up in the parameters. I'm going to click that and I can transpose it up an octave. And you can hear now it's going to be a much higher frequency. And I can lower it. So this will be a good way to create those different layers in different frequency ranges. If we come down to the sub, we can listen to that as well. And there's the layer of the organ. Now we want to make sure there's no masking going on, so let's take a look at the EQ in the analog bass patch. Now there's a lot of boosting going on in the lower frequency ranges at around 100 Hertz. And I can turn on the analyzer right here and take a look at that. And we can see all the boosting that's happening there. Then we're going to come down to the sub bass patch and I'm going to bring up the EQ on this as well. Turn on the analyzer and see what that's doing. And you can see there's a lot of frequencies going on in the sub bass layer around 100 Hertz. So I'm going to come back to the EQ on the analog deep bass patch. And I'm going to turn on the high pass filter. And if you do start to hear some masking, but these are the patches that you want to use, what we can do is filter this out just maybe up to like 80 Hertz or so. And let's take a listen to the analog deep bass. And it's still got some great low end to it. And then we bring the sub. It's going to make sure that there's no masking. So I want to talk real quick about what I call a sub bass warning. And basically, this addresses bass lines that have a very sub low end to it. Now we have 3 layers in our bass line, and so it's pretty wide in the frequency range from the very low with the sub. The mid frequencies are going to be that higher end in the organ, and then the fundamentals of the bass are that deep analog bass patch. But if I was only using the sub bass layer, that's going to sound really great on a big system like a club, but on a smaller system or smaller speakers like small computer speakers or headphones, that sub bass isn't going to be able to be played back, and it might disappear altogether. So what I'll usually do is duplicate that sub bass layer and do some processing to help it stand out in the mix. So let me show you how I do this. Okay, so I'm going to solo this sub bass layer. And if that was the only bass layer I was using for my bass line, I would want to be careful about that sub frequencies disappearing on smaller speakers. So let's come up and duplicate that track, and that'll duplicate a new track and have the exact same settings on it for that bass line. What I'm going to do is copy down the MIDI region, and that will put the pattern there. And what I'm going to do first is bring up a distortion plugin, and we'll just pick distortion, and I'm going to raise the drive up pretty high. The next thing I'm going to do we'll pull this down is I'm going to put a high pass filter on it. Now the frequency ranges that you want to focus on here is around 200 to 500 Hertz. So I'll scoop it out to about 200 Hertz, and that's going to create space for the sub layer that the original patch has, but this distortion layer is just going to focus on the high end. Then I'll also come up to this shelving band right here, and I'll boost it up in the higher frequencies. So after I do that, I'll come down to the mixer, solo both of these, and then I'll remove it, and you can hear there's the original sub bass, and then I'll bring in this new distortion. And it just adds a nice little high end to it that still sounds very much like a part of the bass line, and that'll help it reproduce better on all systems.